Today we're going to talk about sewing face masks. This is probably something you've seen a lot of recently, but I wanted to share some tips that I've learned with you. My mom made tons of these masks for people of different ages, and she received a lot of feedback from them about what was working and what wasn't. And so let's go over some of the suggestions that she made. So the first thing I've done is I've used my pattern to cut out my mask pieces. Right now I'm going to make the teen adult size. So I've cut out 2 rectangles of fabric. These are approximately 9 by 6 1/4 inches. One of the things that people had mentioned when making or using the face masks is that they wanted to be able to tell which was the outside and which was the inside. So using 2 different fabrics can be helpful because then you remember which side is supposed to be pressed up against your face and which side is exposed to the elements. So 2 different colors works great. Something else that we have found with making the face masks is supplies can be a problem. A lot of people don't want to have to go to the store to get supplies to make these masks, and a lot of the stores are out of some of the supplies that you need. Elastic is becoming much more difficult to find. And so I tried to think of a way that we could make this with not as many specialty supplies. To eliminate the interfacing, what I did was for my exterior fabric, I used 1 piece of flannel. It's just a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier, but it gives some structure as the interfacing would, but then interfacing won't be necessary. So 1 piece of flannel for the outside. You can use cotton if you don't have flannel. And then 1 piece of cotton for the inside. Since elastic is starting to be scarce, I'm going to show you today how to make ties yourself. For the ties, rather than bias tape, I'm just using a strip of cotton fabric. This strip is about 1 1/4 inches wide by the width of the fabric, so about 1 1/4 by about 42 inches. So we're going to use that for the straps, and let's get started. So I'm going to take my long piece of fabric here, my 1 1/4 inch strip, and I'm going to fold it in half. I'm going to fold it skinny like a hot dog, and I'm going to press. Take care to protect yourself when you're ironing. So if you need to, use a pressing tool to help protect your fingers from the steam. I find steam does make this process a little bit easier, but it can be quite hot. So I like to use a silicone spatula. So I'm going to fold in this bottom edge to touch the center. You don't want it to cross over the center, but just to barely touch it. And we're going to do that all the way along the edge. Okay, once that side's done, we're going to go ahead and do the same on the top edge. So I'm going to fold the top edge down to that center mark. Again, you don't want it to overlap. Just want it to barely touch. If there's a tiny gap in between your bottom edge and your top edge, that's just fine. It's much better than it overlapping. Okay, now that those 2 edges are both folded in, we are going to take the strip and we are going to fold it in half one more time. So now that those 2 raw edges are in the center, fold it in half again and press. And this time you shouldn't see any raw edges. You should end up with a strip that's a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch, about between 1/4 of an inch and 3/8 of an inch wide. Take the time when you're pressing this to make sure that those folded edges line up really well. It will help you later Okay, my strip is all pressed, and now I'm going to take it to the sewing machine to sew these folds together. Line up your two folded edges. Make sure that your needle is down when you start. Give it a little back stitch and sew those two folds together really close to the edge, about 1/16 of an inch if you can, but you want to make sure you're going through all the layers. If you need to stop and adjust, do that. I found that after stitching, sometimes the fabric can be kind of wavy, especially if you're using a lightweight fabric. I'm using a broadcloth here. It's really thin, and so it gets pretty crinkly after stitching. But if you go back and you press it real quick, it lays a lot flatter. What we're gonna do next is cut this into sections. Depending on the size of the mask you're making, this may be different. Since I'm making the teen adult size, I'm first gonna cut two pieces that are 7.5 inches long. This is 1/2 inch longer than what I would cut if I was doing elastic. So I'm gonna measure 7.5 inches and cut. And 7.5 inches and cut. And then of the piece that's left, I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to cut the center. Okay. I now have two shorter pieces of strapping and two longer pieces. So I'm going to put these together for each side. So I'm going to take one long piece and one short piece. I'm going to take my long piece here, and I'm going to place the short piece on top of it. I'm then going to fold this top edge over, and you want a good 3/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch right here that extends beyond. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew just beyond this edge. We're not actually going to sew it to this. We're kind of making a little channel for it to slide through. So I'm going to do a row of stitching right here just beyond that. So make sure it goes over at least 1/4 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch to 3/8. So let me get that a little closer so you can see. So we're going to sew right here. It's just looping over this piece, and we're going to do the same for the other side. If you like, you can use a little clip to hold it in place. Okay, I'm ready to sew my strap in place. You can use a straight stitch, you can use a zigzag stitch. You just want it to be really secure, and you want it to be close to the strap without actually going over it. Since this is really small, I'm going to hold it with my Purple Thang just to protect my fingers. So I'm using a straight stitch, and I'm going to go over it 3 or 4 times just to make sure it's strong. So that's sewn. If you don't like this little flap holding up, you can do another row of stitches to make sure it stays flat. If you do a zigzag, it kind of holds it in place. And there we go. My ties are now attached to the straps, and I'm ready to put these on my mask. Okay, so take your main fabric, and we're going to mark the placement of the straps. You want to mark each corner from the top and bottom edge. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark the top edge. So I'm going to mark 3/8 of an inch from the top on the right side and the left side. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. I'm going to mark 3/8 of an inch on the right and on the left. And I'm going to use this as a guide to place my straps. Okay, so you want the right side of the strap to be touching the right side of the fabric. And you can use pins or clips, but I'm going to lay one edge of the short strap to the right at the top, aligning the edge with my mark. And then I'm going to take the other edge and I'm going to take care to make sure it's not twisted. And I'm going to put it on the other edge. And now I'm going to repeat for the other side. Right side down. Align. Make sure the raw edges of your strap are touching the raw edges of your mask fabric. Now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and baste that in place. You do want to keep these ties out of your way, so I'm going to stitch here and here. I'm going to be sewing this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Oops. Let's get my purple thing to help. There we go. Let's do all 4 corners. Now that I have my straps attached to my mask, I'm going to go ahead and add the lining that goes inside. What you want to make sure of is that these straps are out of the seam allowance path. We're going to be sewing around the edges and we're going to leave a space here. So we're going to start here, stitch around and stop here, and we're going to leave a little opening. But first, make sure these are all of the way out of the way. You don't want to accidentally stitch on them. Same with these edges here. So let's place this on top. So take your lining piece, lay it right side down on top of the outside fabric and pin it in place. I do find it's helpful to align the corners. So I like to do those first. Use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch around the edge and make sure you back stitch. When you get to the corner, make sure your needle's down, lift your foot up and turn. Our lining's attached and we're ready to turn. Before we do, I'm going to clip the corners. So this will just help reduce some of the bulk. So I'm just going to clip off the little corner here. Take care not to actually cut your stitches and to not cut your straps or your elastic. Reach inside your mask and turn it right side out. I find that the straps or the elastic really help with the turning process. If you tug on them, it will grab those four corners. Be gentle, you don't want to pull super hard, but it does help to get all of those edges turned out. Okay, you can use a Purple Thang or a corner turner to further get those corners. It does help with the appearance of your final project if you take the time to get those little corners. Okay, now that it's turned right side out, it's starting to look almost like a mask. And so let's go ahead and press. When you press, make sure all of your edges are fully turned, so you don't want anything tucked in. You also want this opening to look like you've sewed it, so take care when pressing that section. Okay, now we're ready to add the pleats. So I'm going to flip this over to the wrong side of the fabric. I still have the opening on the bottom, so the opening's here on the bottom. And the first thing I'm going to do is press it in half lengthwise, skinny like a hot dog. You can also use your pattern as a guide for the fold lines if you prefer. So on the pattern, it's got those marks if you prefer to use that. But we're just going to fold it in half and press. Give it a good press. I like to use that steam. And now I'm going to open it back up. And I'm going to fold this to the center. And press. Now I don't want to lose the edge I've already folded. So I'm just going to press this bottom edge here. I'm going to repeat and do the same thing on the top. I've pressed my mask and now I have these 3 nice folds here that are in place. So we're going to use those folds to create our pleats. You're going to grab your first fold and pinch it, and you're going to line it up so that it aligns with about the bottom of the strap. You don't want it to overlap, but just touch. And then clip it in place so you can see it's touching but not overlapping. Clip and do the same on the other side. And then you're going to do the same thing for your middle fold. Pinch it, align it so that you can feel it so it kind of butts right up against the first pleat but does not overlap. Clip, clip, same for the last. Move our strap out of the way. last one. Okay, so we now have our pleats in place, and we're going to take this back to our sewing machine and top stitch. We're going to sew all the way around the rectangle, the whole thing. We're going to use an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and it will close this opening for us. So take care to make sure that this is nice and in place when you're stitching. I'm going to be sewing the mask around the edge with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. This is my opening here, so I'm going to take the time to make sure those edges line up really well. If you like, you can use pins. Pivot at the corner. And I'm going to remove my clips. Now this can be really thick, so go slow if you need to here. Now that you've top stitched, give your mask one last press. And the last thing I want to address is the raw edges. You may notice that there are some raw edges in your project at the ends of your ties here and right where it was hooked here. If that bothers you, there are a couple things you can do. One option is to use fray check. You can simply put a little bit of fray check on those raw edges to help prevent further fraying. Something else you can do is simply tuck under the edge and sew it in place. I find that the raw edges don't bother me, so I just use that little bit of fray check, but you don't have to have it, but it is an option. Something else you can do, if you know in advance when you're making this that you don't want those raw edges, is you can cut your strapping for your ties first and fold under the edges that you know are going to be raw before you make your ties. I like to do my ties all in one go, so I don't do that, but I think it worked quite nice. And so this is our mask. No interfacing, no bias tape, no elastic, and it works super great. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it was helpful to you. I hope you enjoyed this video. Come see me for my next video, and I'll show you how to make this super easy keychain holder for your mask that just fits right inside. So you can carry your masks with you when you're on the go.